All right, good afternoon, and welcome to today's local government education program provided by University of Illinois Extension. My name is Lisa Merrifield, and I am a Community and Economic Development Specialist at the University of Illinois. For sound quality, we have muted your microphones during this presentation. If there's a problem connecting, add those questions to the chat space, and we will answer them. I will monitor the chat space and pose questions and comments at the appropriate time for our speaker. Today's webinar is titled The Economic Impacts of Energy and Transition, Coal Plant and Mine Closures and the Rise of Renewables. Our speaker is Seth Feaster, Energy Data Analyst at the Institute for Energy Economics and Financial Analysis. Seth has been analyzing the U.S. coal and electric power industries since 2015 as part of the Cleveland-based Institute for the Energy Economic and Financial Analysis. As a specialist in visual presentation of economic, financial, and energy data, he has worked with the Federal Reserve Bank of New York and worked for the New York Times for over 25 years. A recording of this webinar will be made available on our local government education website and on our YouTube channel. Participants will receive slides and a link to resources and the recording for today's webinar. At this time, I'll turn it over to Seth.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for participating. I just want to go over quickly what the broad aim of this presentation hopes to achieve. I'm going to be providing an overview at a national level first of what's happening with both the coal industry and the electric power industry, where there are tremendous changes occurring. And then I'll focus in more closely on the Illinois Basin. I'll talk a little bit about the structure of the coal industry there and talk about the reasons why this whole energy transition is happening. And lastly, I'll walk through how this looks like it may play out over the next 20 years in the Illinois Basin and talk about some of the impacts and challenges that local and regional leaders are likely to face as this transition unfolds. So this will be in three parts, the U.S. and regional coal overview. And in that regard, coal production in the United States is falling. And that has a lot to do with the electric power industry's changes because the power industry uses 90% of the coal consumed in the U.S., but it's also closed about a quarter of all the coal-fired capacity since 2011. So it's a pretty quick transition that's underway. To talk a little bit about why this is happening, I'm going to frame this as technology disruptions, and that's a much better way than a lot of the sort of polarized rhetoric out there about what's happening, because the technology behind this and the economic changes are impacted by how disruptions play out. And anybody who's familiar with some of these kinds of technology disruptions in the past, whether you're talking about mobile phones or even something like the introduction of the automobile, understands how quickly and dramatically technology disruptions can transform the economic landscape. And lastly, I'm going to talk more directly about the factors driving the decline of coal-fired power, and that has a lot to do with the rise of cheap gas, renewables, and the aging and inflexible plant structure of the coal-fired power sector. So you're going to see a lot of visual presentations here, a lot of charts about what's happening, and this presentation, I believe, will be available on the Extension website when this is over. So the biggest picture here is the look at U.S. coal production, and this gives you some idea of how it's played out. This is almost 100 years, and you can see that there was an enormous rise in coal production in this country. And we'll get to a little bit about why that was the case. But you also see in particular that after the peak production of coal in 2008, where the US produced almost 1.2 billion tons of coal that year, it's fallen precipitously and is going to be about half of that by next year. That's just a tremendous and rapid change in the coal industry. This gives you a little bit of an idea of how this is playing out regionally. The change has been underway much longer in Appalachia and in the interior, where the Illinois Basin, which is a big part of the interior region of coal production. Their production peaked in 1990 in the West, which has got a lot to do with the Powder River Basin. Production peaked only in 2008, but it has also fallen very fast since then. And one of the things that I want to point out in this slide is that Appalachia has fallen so dramatically that the interior region, most of which is Illinois Basin coal, could outproduce Appalachia in a couple of years, because it's getting very, very close to the same amount of production of coal in Appalachia and the interior. This is what it looks like state by state. There have been some big ramp ups, particularly around 2010 in Illinois, but also Western Kentucky. Some of that has fallen off. And we can talk about some of the reasons behind that ramp up in production. The job picture has kind of mirrored that production rise and fall. Employment is about the same now as it was in 2001, and this covers coal mining in Southern Illinois, Southern Indiana, and Western Kentucky. This does not cover Eastern Kentucky. That's where the Illinois Basin is, and you'll see that in a minute. But since 2012, about 4,600 jobs in this region have been lost. That's a pretty big decline in a pretty short period of time. We also think that that number is likely to continue going down. So this is the region that we're talking about here in this presentation, and also in a report that IEFA just released about the Illinois Basin, which is available on the IEFA website. We're looking at about a little over 1 million tons of coal produced in 2018, but a pretty concentrated region of mining. As you can see, there are a great deal of the coal, probably about 3/4 of the coal, is produced in the top 15 mines. This sort of highlights in the little pies at the corners how much coal is produced in the top 5 mines in each state. And each of these circles is scaled to show how much production is occurring at each mine. So you can see that some of these, and some of the mines will have different names locally than they may in the information, the way the government keeps track of these mines. So I'm going to refer to the Hamilton complex as MC number 1. That's, for example, in the middle of Southern Illinois there, that produced almost 14.5 million tons of coal. That's one of the biggest mines in the region. I'm now going to go through a little bit about the companies and where the companies are. There are 6 major coal mining firms involved in the Illinois Basin, and they account for about 90% of all the coal production. The largest of which is Alliance Resource Partners. They have mines in all 3 states. They recently closed down the Dotiki mine in Kentucky and have idled the Gibson North part of the complex at the Gibson mining complex. So that is highlighted on this map, and you'll see some other mines that have recently been announced as closing or idling in these slides. Second largest producer is Murray Energy with its partner Foresight. Murray, as some of you may know, recently declared bankruptcy. and Foresight is looking a little financially challenged at the moment as well. They are the operator of the MC#1 mine in the Hamilton complex and have some other mines in Illinois and Kentucky, but no properties in Indiana. Peabody Energy, which is a giant, the largest coal producer in the United States, but also has operations in Australia. They are the third largest producer of coal, and this is a look at their mines. They recently have announced a little more aggressive mine closure schedule, and some of these mine complexes have been shut down, or they will be shut down very soon. There's Hallador Energy, which is concentrated in Indiana. They have a few properties in Indiana. Arch, which is a big national firm with a lot of properties. They have a few mines in Illinois. And lastly is White Stallion, producing about 5% of all production there, and they're mostly in Indiana. So I want to switch this from a perspective about the coal mining side to the consumption side. Since most coal in this country, including about 80% of Illinois Basin coal, is consumed by the electric power industry. Only about a decade ago, all the electricity in the United States, about 50% of it was produced by burning coal. That is expected to drop to just 22% next year. That is an enormous change in a relatively short period of time. The way I want to frame this, though, as I mentioned earlier, is about these technology disruptions. And I like to think of this as 7 more or less separate but interrelated kinds of disruptions that are happening. The first set can be thought of as on the generation side, and that has to do with energy efficiency, which affects demand, wind and solar, which obviously are the key renewables that we're talking about, fracking, which has had an enormous impact on everything from the oil and gas industry to the electric power industry, which burns the natural gas that's been produced from fracking. But there's also several changes that are really occurring on the grid, what I call the grid side. The first being the way in which grid operators, and this is sort of the structure of the power industry that's above utilities, they manage the grid and make sure that it's reliable and resilient in order to provide power for everyone. Their ability to integrate vast amounts of renewable resources from lots and lots of locations has been key to how renewables have been growing in importance. There's also a factor here of grid independence, and that's the ability of people to put solar panels on their roof, but also lots of commercial businesses from Walmart to lots of other companies are able to generate their own power either locally or through power contracts. And that has changed to some extent the business dynamic of what's happening in the power industry. And lastly, there is a rapidly growing disruption in energy storage, really batteries, that utilities are starting to install in huge amounts because it offers lots of benefits to them for grid resilience and cost savings. So that's sort of the big picture. And I want to go through a little bit about the generation side and give you some perspective about how these things are changing the whole environment. The first piece is demand for electricity. And the key here is that for many, many decades, it was taken as a truism that in order to have economic growth, you had to have more electricity generation. So there was a very close relationship between economic growth and energy consumption. That changed around the time of the financial crisis in 2007, 2008. and energy, the growth in electricity consumption and by proxy generation has stayed flat for almost a decade here. There has been very little growth in power demand and power generation for almost 10 years. And this is very, very important because on the grid, whenever you put on new resources now, whether it's a gas plant or a wind farm, it means that it generally pushes something else off. So it's no longer all hands on deck and everything that we build we're going to use. Now there's a much more powerful economic rationale for what stays and what goes. This is a little out of order to the first slide, but the second key thing here is to understand the scale and scope of what's really horizontal drilling and hydraulic fracturing. Everybody refers to it as fracking. We're going to speak specifically today about the natural gas side of that, not the oil side of that, because oil is not really used in the electric power industry. But to get a sense of just how astonishing this transformation has been, you can look at this chart where it goes from only 2 trillion cubic feet of natural gas produced in 2007 to more than 10 times that last year. It is just an extraordinary change, especially when you look at this in the long-term historical perspective. It is just an enormous change in the energy picture in the United States. Lastly, I want to talk a little bit about wind and solar growth. Wind, which even though there's a lot of press about solar power, wind has become vastly greater in importance sooner in the electricity generation landscape. And that's because each wind turbine that you put up, you can generate an awful lot of power. And the wind power revolution is kind of about a decade ahead in many ways of the solar power revolution, at least in how it's playing out on the ground and how it's getting built out. And so you can see here just how rapidly wind power has grown. And it is now, in April of this year, wind provided about 10% of all the power in the United States. Solar is, if you combine utility scale solar and rooftop solar, that's at about 3% combined. In both cases, there is also rapid growth here in renewables. I want to show one more slide about wind, which is how much it's grown, and again, the speed of this is happening. So comparing 2008 and 2018, this looks at how much of each state's generation it comes from wind. And in 2008, there were only 4 states. They got a little over 5% of their power from wind. By last year, that had risen to 21 states, and 3 of those states, close to 4 of those states really, got about a third of their power that was generated within the state from wind. So tremendous change here in the energy picture on a state-by-state level. And you can see this is largely happening in the Great Plains from Texas north to the Dakotas. So how are those changes affecting power generation nationally and regionally? So on the national level, this slide shows how wind and solar have been rising, natural gas has been rising, and coal is bearing the brunt of these changes. Nuclear power has stayed essentially flat. Hydro has also stayed flat. So all the changes in the fuel mix for the electric power sector are happening between coal going down and natural gas and renewables rising. And it was about 3 or 4 years ago, 2015, when natural gas exceeded coal generation, natural gas fueled power exceeded coal generation. And we expect now that if you combine hydro, wind, and solar and other forms of renewables, that renewables combined are going to exceed coal generation in 2021. This is a couple of slides here to talk about how this is playing out at the state level. Illinois, where I think a lot of our listeners today are listening from. Coal has fallen from just about half in 2008 to about a third last year. So that's it's a significant decline in market share. A lot of that's been made up by growth in wind generation and natural gas generation. You'll see that some of these other states, the change is even more dramatic. Illinois has a relatively balanced generation mix. Indiana, which within the state doesn't generate any power from nuclear, the change is a little more dramatic because coal has gone from almost all the generation in Indiana to 69%, and a lot of that has to do with growth of natural gas fueled generation. I'm going to show Florida and Georgia here for two reasons. One is that we recently took a look at 9 southern states because the southern states so far have had very little renewable generation, but coal is still rapidly declining in that region. And it's almost entirely because of natural gas. The other reason I want to show Florida and Georgia is because the coal generation that's there, some of it is fueled by Illinois Basin coal. And so this gives you a little bit broader perspective about the marketplace where Illinois Basin coal is being sent. So big changes here in both states in the mix of fuels. Natural gas is really on the ascendancy and coal has declined rapidly here. And lastly, 2 states where, again, coal has been very dominant, and both, particularly Kentucky is obviously a place where Illinois Basin coal is used. But even in Kentucky, where coal remained steady and resisted the changes that were coming for quite a number of years, even there has been a drop in coal use and a significant rise in the use of natural gas to generate power. In Ohio, it's even more dramatic. It's gone from 85% to half, and the commensurate rise in natural gas has been dramatic as well. So in our report that we released a couple days ago, we start with a statement that seems pretty strong, that 20 years from now, most of the Illinois Basin coal industry will be gone. And so I'm going to now switch to a look at why we think that's the case. Now, I've already laid some groundwork here by talking about the national trends in energy and economics around the power industry that have been happening, but I'm going to go into a little more detail about how that's going to play out as it relates to the power industry and Illinois Basin coal. So this slide looks at the power plants that use Illinois Basin coal. Now, I mentioned earlier that about 80% of Illinois Basin coal is consumed by the power industry. The rest of it, there's a little bit that goes to industrial and commercial customers, and then the rest of it is exported. This slide starts to look at those domestic power plant customers. The orange dots here are the 10 largest purchasers. Each dot is scaled according to how much coal the plant consumes. And I've labeled the top 10 plants here. And in the pie chart, you can see that those top 10 customers, which are led by Gibson and Prairie State, and the third one is actually Petersburg, and I'll get back to that in a minute. They consume collectively, those top 10 plants, over half of all the coal that's mined in the Illinois Basin. So the fate of these plants becomes very, very important to understand what's going to happen to the coal industry. This combines where that coal goes with the plans that the utilities have announced for retirement of some or all of the units at those coal-fired plants. And there are quite a few. So some of these plants like G.G. Allen and Hammond, Hammond was closed this year, as was Gorgas. Those plants used a lot more coal in the past, and they've been using less and less. But there are other plants, and I want to talk about Gibson in particular, that use a fair amount of coal still, that are expected to retire in the relatively near future. Gibson is significant, and we talk about this in our report, because there is now a plan, and it's been accelerated from what used to be thought of as the life of the plant. So there are 5 big units there. Gibson in Indiana is one of the largest coal-fired power plants in the country. And there are 5 units, and they are now scheduled to be retired between 2026 and 2038. And we're using that final date when the last 2 units are going to be closed as sort of the benchmark, signaling when we think that the coal industry is going to have almost disappeared. That's why we chose the 2038 point in time. Because if the largest plant is gone, and a lot of these other plants will be gone before then, it's hard to see how the coal industry survives in this region. So more broadly, the history of retirements in recent years is that most retirements are being announced within only a couple of years of when they're actually going to retire. And in some cases, they're only months before they retire. We just had an announcement from AES Indianapolis Power and Light that they want to close 2 units at the Petersburg plant, which is the 3rd largest consumer of Illinois Basin coal, in 2021 and 2023. Now, there's also, and they said they were going to revisit closing the other 2 units in their next integrated resource plan, which is, they release that in 3 years. So most utilities release a plan about what they're going to be doing with their generation assets every 3 years or so. And so here's a plant, big consumer of Illinois Basin coal, wasn't scheduled to close any of these units for more than a decade, is now starting to move them way up and talk about shutting not just some, but potentially the entire plant. And other plants in this fleet that the Illinois Basin coal serves are in the same boat. In particular, Plant Bowen in Georgia is likely to retire in the relatively near future, in the next few years. So what we're seeing here is an enormous attrition in the customer base for Illinois Basin coal. And that is expected only to continue to worsen. We're looking at natural gas production that has gone through the roof, and prices commensurately are staying very, very low, and they're expected to stay low for the next couple of years. That is incredibly competitive with coal. And we're seeing renewable industry where prices for building renewables and generating that power have been falling year in and year out. And they're getting more and more competitive with coal. And in some cases, they're getting more and more competitive with gas. And so there's a tremendous shift, transition that's happening as these fuels replace coal. It's the coal plants, most of which are relatively old, or they're 30 and 40 years old, in some cases even older than that. And they're not cheap to run, and they're becoming what we call uneconomic. They're not competitive in the marketplace against cheap gas and renewables where the price is coming down. So that leaves as a solution, if there's going to be much left to mining coal in this region, is what happens to exports. And so that's the thing that I want to turn to here. There has been a relative boom in recent years in exports from the Illinois Basin, almost all of it coming out of Illinois. But that market is facing its own challenges because Europe in particular is going through the exact same energy transition as the United States. In some ways, it's ahead of us. So coal demand is dropping very fast in Europe, particularly for imports. But other places around the world that have traditionally bought a fair amount of coal, including India, Japan, and South Korea, are also ramping up their effort to switch to renewables, partly for energy independence reasons, partly for environmental reasons, but overarchingly, it's about economic reasons, that generation from other sources is often cheaper than coal. On top of that, US producers are facing growing competition from foreign producers, such as Russia, because the market, there's a huge amount of coal available in the market, and others have some competitive advantages because US coal has to be shipped such long distances. This takes a look at sort of the volatile nature of the thermal coal export marketplace. And I should pause for a second and mention that there are really two kinds of coal. There's thermal coal, which is used in power plants, and that's the only kind of coal that the Illinois Basin produces. There is another kind of coal called metallurgical coal, which is used in steel plants, that is produced in Appalachia and a couple of other places. But what we're talking about here is coal that's used in power plants. And the export markets can be volatile. It's all based on price in a global market. And so you can see that in 2012, the export market was booming, but it also declined very rapidly over the next 4 years to 2016. Since then, it's rebounded, but it's also forecast to drop in the next couple of years. And that's because the price does not support overseas shipments. And this slide takes a look a little more closely at the relationship between price on the global market and production in the United States on a finer scale. This is a quarterly look at production. A quarterly look at exports. So I'm going to wrap up and talk a little bit more broadly about what's going on here economically, locally, and regionally. So the consequence of this transition and the way it's playing out in the economy, particularly for the mining industry and the power industry, is that so the mining industry is likely to go away. The power industry is going to be just fine. They are still going to be there producing power. They are going to be simply switching how they generate that power to other sources of fuel, whether it's wind or natural gas or solar. And but the big loser here is the coal industry. There's also going to be losses of power plant jobs and the supporting parts of the economy that support those plants as they close. So as we look across the country, there's a number of things that ends up happening here, and this is already unfolding. In fact, in the closure of several Vistra plants in Illinois is a good indicator of some of how quickly this can happen and the scale at which it can happen. So there's obviously loss of power plant jobs, there's loss of coal mining jobs for the communities and regions where these assets are located. There's loss of tax revenue and royalties sometimes. There's also some real long-term damage because as coal companies go bankrupt, they usually, to get out of bankruptcy, cut their pension benefits and their health care for both their retired employees, and sometimes they are cutting back on their current employees. That's bad news for the long term for communities, because those pension benefits and the healthcare benefits that were going to retirees probably would have stayed, that money would have stayed in those communities for a couple of decades after they retired. That support is going away, although there is legislation out there to help address that. But at the moment, those are real long-term costs to the local economies. Often this is part of the reason why doing this presentation, because it's very hard for local officials or even regional officials to understand how these big economic changes are playing out. And so responses often begin after there's already been a lot of deterioration in the industry, or loss of power plants or mines get shut. And so there's already a tremendous amount of financial damage that's happened, and it's tough to recover and deal with planning and preparation when you've already been hurt from these changes. And I don't think this is true in the Illinois Basin, but some areas of the country have tax policies that actually work to prevent communities from doing any planning, even if they know that these changes are coming, because they're not able to build up some of their resources to prepare for them. It's also the case that in places that we've watched try and stop plant closures or stop mine closures, there's a lot of energy expended on trying to stop those changes. In very few instances has that been successful, but what it does tend to do is delay the response time to prepare for the financial changes that are coming. And it's often, we think, a relative waste of time to try and do these reactive and defensive responses. It's much better to be a little more proactive and planning oriented about how you're going to deal with these changes, because the changes are just these enormous economically driven changes that are happening in big sectors of the economy. It's very tough for small areas to actually resist those kinds of changes. This is the next bullet point here is significant for the Illinois Basin, because a lot of this in the southern parts of Indiana and Illinois and the western part of Kentucky may be a little bit far or out of view of power centers and the economic centers in those states. And it can be tough, especially when this industry is divided across several states, to get states and federal agencies to focus on helping. There are also something that we can talk about more of if you have questions, but competing interests can complicate your policy responses. Sure, it might be great to save a coal plant, but ratepayers may not be so happy about paying extra for their power in order to save that coal plant. Likewise, the natural gas industry is likely to oppose any kind of policy changes that support coal. That's been true in the renewable energy sector as well. So there's been pushback on a lot of renewable energy policy because of these kinds of competing interests around policy responses. And lastly, you're all very well aware of, it is tough for smaller communities and very economically dependent communities to respond to these kinds of changes, because they often have less expertise and fewer resources to do any kind of economic development planning. But I'm going to conclude my presentation with some good news. The changes that are happening, even though they're pretty bad for the coal industry, they can be really pretty good in some ways for a lot of rural areas. Wind and solar facilities are often spread around. You can pretty much, wind you can't just build anywhere, but solar you almost can. You can build it in a lot of places, and you don't have to have vast amounts of land in order to do that. So you can spread these generation facilities around. And what that means is that you also spreading around the pilot payments and tax money, other forms of revenue to rural communities, usually, where they haven't been benefiting from the power industry the same way in the past. And that means a lot of direct payments sometimes to farmers. And that kind of non-agricultural income, especially if it's scheduled to be over 20 years, which they often are, can be very, very important to stabilize economies, particularly rural agricultural economies, over the long term. If you know you have a certain amount of money coming in, that can support you in ways that fluctuations, as we've seen in agricultural commodities and export markets, are not able to do. So that steady income from some of these renewable energy facilities can be very, very important. It also means for counties the same thing. If you have a long-term revenue stream from pilot payments because of a wind farm or solar power facilities that are being built, you can make changes to your county budgets that allow for some long-term planning and can be very helpful. We worked with a group of MBA students that took a look at a county in northwestern Ohio called Paulding County. And we were quite surprised at the benefits that that county received, because even though there were not a lot of direct jobs from renewable energy facilities, there were a lot of indirect jobs. So that the school district in that county was able to hire, I believe, 8 to 10 extra people because of the revenue coming in from a couple of wind farms that were installed. And that was long-term income where they could plan for it and they could hire those people knowing that that money was going to be there for a while. That county also saw some benefits from an increased bond rating because they had the extra money coming in, and that helped prevent other kinds of tax increases that they might have had to enact. It also means that when you have this money flowing into your region, that you're going to be helping your economy. It can also lower your cost of power. And in so far, we think that there's much less risk of a legacy cleanup costs compared with coal mining or other kinds of power generation. And lastly, it's good news in many ways in a broader sense as well, because something called distributed generation, where you're able to produce power in a bunch of different places instead of like one giant power generation site, allows for better grid resiliency and reliability. There are some real benefits to that in some parts of the country, particularly rural areas that are often at the end of the line of the power grid. It also means some really big potential benefits from energy independence, because it means that some individuals, if you're a big farm operation or a business where you use a fair amount of power, you could potentially generate your own power, even if you're still attached to the grid. This is not about getting off the grid, but your ability to generate power and cut your costs. So that's a pretty significant benefit. And especially if an area starts to lower its overall cost of power, you can have an advantage in luring other businesses to that area. So with that, I hope those are some good news benefits from these changes that will resonate. I'm going to stop the presentation.
All right, thank you so much, Seth. That was incredibly useful. We at Illinois Extension do know of a couple resources to help communities make some of these transitions, and we will be posting that and sending it to you with the PowerPoint and the follow-up if you are looking for specific ways to help your community. We do have a couple quick questions coming in. Let's see. Mark asks, throughout my time as a Midwesterner, I've often observed wind farms concentrated in pockets. while in other areas there are very little. In some instances, I've even observed signs such as no wind farms, etc. Can you please speak to this concentration of wind farms in certain areas? And can you also speak to the resistance that farmers sometimes have to wind farms? One comment, Seth, before you answer this. In Illinois, the middle part of the state is very amenable to wind farms, but the southern part is hillier and not so windy. So that is some of it, but doesn't speak totally to the pockets. So Seth, do you have any comments on wind farm placement?
Sure. There are a variety of reasons why there are variations in location of some of these facilities. The first and foremost is that some places are windier than others, and that's true in northwestern Illinois. There's kind of a wind gradient that the further south and east you go, the less wind potential there is, and so developers are going to concentrate on those areas that are most beneficial to their projects first. That said, there are other reasons why there's variability. That works on both a state level and a local level. So on a state level, there has been a lot of resistance in some states to wind energy. And part of it is that it's been, there's been resistance about development. There's been resistance about simply the fact that it's wind. But a lot of that resistance has fallen by the wayside in some of these Great Plains states because the development money and the economic benefits have far outweighed the criticisms. And a lot of these states that are that tend to have more resistance to some, quote unquote, renewable energy are changing that perspective. One of the most amazing examples to me is Texas, which will be soon generating about 20% of its power. And Texas is by far the largest power producer in the country and largest consumer of power. But they have built out, they started under Governor Rick Perry to build out a transmission system where they could move the power from the panhandle of Texas to the cities that were further east. That is one of the impediments actually across the Midwest and the Great Plains, is that there has to be a way, if you build these wind farms, to get the power to the places that need it. And there is a big development in Wyoming that is going to be building a power line all the way down to Las Vegas so that it can reach the grid connections there and supply power from wind farms in Wyoming to California. But there's also the challenges of simply moving power to the east from states like Iowa towards Chicago and some of the more power hungry metropolitan areas further east. So that's some of the reasons. And then of course there's local resistance that can vary from place to place about why you might need that. And if you have a couple of holdouts of landowners in an area where some developer wants to build a wind farm, but those holdouts make it less economic to build it, they're likely to walk away and move on somewhere else. So there's some of the reasons why there's variability.
All right, thanks so much. Hattie asks, where are solar panels being manufactured? Are they being made in the U.S. to create sustainable jobs? Should communities try to attract solar panel manufacturing plants? Installation jobs are temporary and maintenance jobs need very few individuals. So is solar panel manufacturing a potential industry?
That's a great question. And it has to do with the economics of that supply chain in the same way that most electronics these days are built in Asia. And there have been changes because of the changing tariff structures about the competitiveness of building some of these or even assembling some of these panels in the United States. Some of that is happening here. But by and large, I think there's a global market for this, for solar panels, and that's a whole nother level of competition. it is tough for a small community or even a state to tip the playing field, as it were, to get that manufacturing to come to some of those areas. If you are a state with enough clout, such as perhaps Florida, New York, or Illinois, you may be able to provide enough incentives in order to get some of that manufacturing to come to the state. But by and large, it's the economics, the global economics that's driving where these things are made. That said, the same sourcing problem, local sourcing problem, is true in most of these other kinds of fuels as well. Florida is paying for coal from the Illinois Basin, so that's not exactly locally sourced either. And it shouldn't get in the way, we think, of ratepayers paying less for power. So there are reasonable and serious concerns about where you're getting some of this material and whether or not it's supporting your local economy. But simply from the point of view of power generation, you can easily focus on the benefits of getting cheaper power for ratepayers.
All right, thank you. Another listener mentioned that they would be interested in finding examples of communities that have made this transition successfully and what combination of strategies were used. Before you talk about this, Seth, you might consider listening to our webinar from, I think it was November 21st, our last webinar. We had some presenters that gave some examples of communities that had transitioned successfully. I will also put together some resources that have examples of those, of what we know about, and put that out to the group. Certainly at Illinois Extension, we're interested in continuing to have this discussion with people in Illinois. So Seth, do you know of some good examples of communities that have transitioned?
Well, I think that the example of Paulding County in Ohio is a great example. There are other examples, more recent examples, maybe in Colorado, where some of the rural co-ops have decided to switch to a much higher percentage of renewables and gotten into some contracts to make that transition over a period of about a decade or so. There are some good examples like that on the local level. There are other clear examples on the state level.
Are you still there, Seth?
State legislation that is is really in many ways shut down wind power development in that state. And so what's happening is the developers are simply moving next door to Indiana, and they're probably coming to Illinois as well, because small changes in state policy can make or break a lot of these projects. So at the state level, there are significant differences from state to state.
All right. Ron mentions HR 763, which is a New Day in Coalfields white paper that sets aside about 0.75% of the carbon fee and the carbon fee dividend to help coal communities transition. And that, he says, will make wind economically viable in Southern Illinois. So interesting. Do you know anything about that?
I'm not familiar with that particular piece of legislation, but we at IEFA strongly believe that there needs to be some way of a just transition, because just closing these industries down can cause tremendous amounts of economic damage for a long period of time in these communities. And there are I think really reasonable ways, now that we know that these changes really are coming and that there are tremendous economic forces that are making these changes happen. It should be possible for states in particular, but also the federal government, to craft policies that allow for this transition to support the workers that are losing their jobs and support the communities that are losing their tax base in some cases or other forms of revenue. But that there's really a patchwork of response across the country. Some states are doing a lot and others are doing nothing at all. And we think that that's a little unfortunate because there could be much better planning that would really ease this transition as it's happening.
Wonderful. Another question, Northwest Georgia has seen solar generation by individual companies to sell to the grid and by individual water and sewers to generate their own power. Do you see that more large power users might want to invest in generation of their own power where possible? And are there technologies for storage of renewable energy generated? That's the battery capacity. How's that? Where do we see that?
So there's two sides to that. Let me answer the first.
Okay.
Yes, many companies are starting to be more closely examine the possibility of generating their own power, and there's two solutions to that. Some of the biggest companies, a lot of the tech companies, are getting their power through power purchase agreements with developers that are developing these kinds of renewable energy projects. Some companies, particularly when you get down to a smaller scale, Walmart is putting solar panels on the roofs of its stores so that it cuts its power demand right there at each store. So there's a number of solutions, but absolutely, we think that's the piece back in the beginning of this presentation where I talked about energy independence. It doesn't mean living in a cabin in the woods with a couple of solar panels on your roof. It does mean that some of these companies, including really big power consumers, are able to really cut the cost of their power, and that is really a bit of a disruption for the whole power market, because when you have some of your biggest customers who want to just generate their own power, that can be a problem. It can also be a tremendous benefit, because if you've got an area where you're more you've got regulations, or you're more supportive of companies that want to come in and build renewable energy to support, whether it's a data center or other kinds of businesses, that may be a tremendous advantage to luring those businesses to your area. So that's definitely a significant part of this.
Great, thank you. What's the best way to communicate those whose livelihoods depend on coal production consumption that coal is leaving? How do we educate the average coal-dependent citizen without delegitimizing their life perspective or bringing the conversation to an agree or disagree halt?
That's a challenging question. I mean, coal mining families, coal mining communities are some of the most hardest working people in this country, and they have suffered tremendously, both in terms of their health oftentimes and to their economies, as the coal sector has continuously shrunk over the last few decades in many places. And they've also been hurt by the bankruptcy process, where coal companies are able to cut back on their pensions and really eliminate their long-term health benefits in many cases. So, and I don't personally think it's particularly fair for them to be at the mercy of sort of some of these bigger forces without some support from local, regional, and federal people, leadership, to help them go through this transition. But that's always a challenge. It's a leadership challenge. It's a political challenge in this country to be able to support those people. They absolutely deserve to get some benefits for all their work and the support that they've provided for the economy over the years.
All right. One more quick question, and then we'll end. Somebody asked about why we're not discussing hydropower as a renewable power source, And another listener chimed in that water level behind major dams is being reduced and reduces the amount of power that can be generated. Do you have any comments, further comments on hydro?
Sure. The difference between hydro and some of these other things that we're talking about, wind, solar, and storage, natural gas, is that it is pretty tough to build out more big hydro projects for a whole host of reasons. So there's not going to be a large amount of growth in hydropower production. That said, it is definitely a renewable resource. And when you put it together with what's happening in wind and solar, it's worth thinking about those things together. And that's where we see, if you include hydropower, renewable energy surpassing coal in just 2 years. So we haven't forgotten about hydro, but the growth curve for wind and solar, which you can really put almost anywhere, you can really, to build new hydro resources, there's often very specialized conditions in the environment that you need to have, and they often are really huge kinds of infrastructure projects to build dams. And there's obviously controversies around those kinds of projects too. Wind and solar, by and large, are much easier to build and can be built almost anywhere. Less so with wind, obviously, but that's why we're seeing the kind of growth in these other renewable resources.
All right, thank you so much. You will see on your screen a poll. If you haven't answered already, please give us some feedback on how useful this was and how much information you gained. And thank you for participating in today's webinar. A video recording will be available on our website within 2 to 3 business days, and we will also provide some resources. You will get all that by email as well. After the new year, we'll once again be offering our state and federal legislative update webinars that will feature experts from the Illinois Association of County Board Members and the National Association of Counties. The state legislative update will be at noon on January 23rd, and the federal update will be at noon on January 30th. Experts will be discussing recent potential future changes to legislation that may have a direct impact on Illinois local governments and help officials and agency staff and other professionals to plan. Registration information will be sent out soon. Once again, thank you so much, and I look forward to seeing you on our next webinar.